My name is Juan Martinez. I'm a professor here at Fuller Seminary, and during this second session, we're going to be looking at the historical causes of migration from south to north in the Americas. We're going to look at the fact that the migratory patterns that we see today are closely linked to the history of the United States and its interventions in Latin America, and that the issues of migration north are also linked to how Christians have seen each other, especially Catholics in Latin America and Protestants in North America. In the first session, Dr. Garcia Johnson mentioned 5 areas that have sort of defined the unequal relationships that then lead also to the kinds of patterns we're talking about. He talked about racial ethnic tensions and definitions, where one group of people defines itself as superior to another group of people, and how that group of people sees itself with the rights to take natural resources and to take control of those natural resources for their own economic gain. And how that process then is justified through all kinds of authority mechanisms and then becomes normative and then becomes the normality. And so you're going to see that happening as we think about the migratory patterns and how the United States has intervened and has seen Latin America as its own backyard. We're going to do 3 things during our 2 sessions. One is we're going to see that migratory pattern in its historical context. We're going to think about and reflect on the logic of that expansion that has created this migratory pattern. And we want to be looking at how churches have responded to it. We're going to do it in 2 sections. We're going to go from the time of the U.S. takeover through 1965. 1965 is key because of the immigration law that was written and approved that year. And then the second section will look from 1965 to the present. Now, a couple things are in order for us to get started as we think about this. One is that we have to remember that the vast majority of immigrants from Latin America would consider themselves Christian, be they Catholic or Protestant. And amongst the Protestants, most of them today are Pentecostal. And so we've got a migration of Christians into a Christian nation. That's different than the way migration is usually presented as Muslims or others coming. It's Christians coming to a Christian nation. Now, migration affects all of the United States, but migrants, and particularly those who have irregular status or undocumented, are mostly concentrated in just a few states. For example, right now, 2019, about 25% of all undocumented aliens in the United States live in the state of California. Another 16% live in Texas. And 5% live in each of Florida, New York, Illinois, and New Jersey. So just in those 6 states, you've got well over 60% of all the undocumented in the United States. Now, of those undocumented, about 75% come from Mexico and Central America and other parts of Latin America to a lesser extent. About 10% from Asia, and then the rest from the rest of the world. So we find ourselves in a situation where Latinos are the largest group of undocumented, and they're mostly concentrated in California and largely in Southern California. Now, the migratory waves that created the modern Americas were part of European expansion. We have to remember that the first migration and migratory movement that influences how we think about things today is the out-migration from Europe. Catholics from Spain and Portugal into what we now call Latin America, and Protestants mostly from England and from other Protestant nations into what we now call North America for the most part, with the French Catholics in Quebec being a major exception to that pattern. But those people migrate, they take over, they come with the intention of conquest. They see themselves as God's superior people. Both the Catholics, especially from Spain, and the Protestants from England, saw themselves as God's select people that had the right to conquer. Many times the English and later the Americans would see themselves as the new Israel that was conquering the new Canaan. So that gave them the right to impose themselves, to push away, to kill the Canaanites, if you will. But those people also brought African slaves, cheap and a workforce to the Americas, changing also that migratory pattern. So they came to in conquest, and they came imposing the slave system on the Americas and on the economy that they were establishing. Now, interestingly, both Catholics and Protestants justify all of this theologically because they are God's chosen people. Again, that ethnic, racial understanding. So then, in that environment, as the countries of the Americas become independent of the European powers, the United States becomes an expansionist country. It doesn't stay on the eastern seaboard. It wants to go from sea to shining sea, as the national hymn says it. And so first they buy land, the Louisiana Purchase from the French, who had conquered it from the native peoples. They buy the Northwest Territories from England, again, that had been conquered from native peoples. But then they conquer half of Mexico's territory. In 1835, people in Texas who had become Mexican citizens, in 1836, they rebel against the Mexican government with the help of the United States and become independent, and they claim large part of the Southwest as their territory, even though they never had control of it, and most of it was Mexico. In 1846, President Polk justifies a war of invasion against Mexico, much weaker, saying that Mexico had killed American troops on American territory because it had killed troops that had come into the territory that was widely understood to be Mexican, but it justified the war. The United States entered all the way into Mexico City and then debated how much of Mexico they wanted to keep. Some people thought keeping all of Mexico. That's why it's called the United States of America. It was going to be of all the Americas. But in the U.S. Congress, famously one senator, Senator Calhoun, says, and if we take all of Mexico, what are we going to do with 6 million Indians? Again, that sense of these people are not at our level. So in the end, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it gives, cedes all the Southwest to the United States, supposedly sold for $25 million. Of course, the United States charged Mexico $25 million for starting the war. And so, obviously, the United States did not give the Mexican government a penny for the land that it took. It will do something similar in Havana, Cuba in 1898 with Spain, sinking the ship the Maine and claiming it was Spain that did it, even though 100 years later the United States finally confessed that, in fact, it was the United States action to justify the war. And the United States then took over Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And in 1899, Puerto Rico became a colony of the United States. So this is the pattern of first geographic intervention. The pattern of economic, political, and social intervention will continue throughout the 20th century. Such it is that Juan Gonzalez, the author, when he writes the story of Latinos in the United States, he calls it the harvest of empire. Every time the empire has expanded, one of the direct results has been migration north. So to this day, almost 2/3 of all Latinos in the United States are Mexican or Mexican descent. A significant percentage are Puerto Rican. And then others will come from other points of intervention of the United States and Latin America. From 1848 to 1900, about 100,000 of these Mexicans that lived in the Southwest became American citizens by treaty. Though some of them lived near the border, especially the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo River, and so they built towns on both sides. So you had Laredo, Texas. They built Nuevo Laredo just in case they needed to be on the other side of the border, which side they want to be on. And they created these sister cities that are not common amongst most countries, where borders become points of encounter, not just the end of one and the starting of another. But of those 100,000 who stayed, most of them were Catholic, at least nominally. But both the American Catholic Church and the American Protestant churches saw them as backward, semi-pagan. So American Catholics imposed bishops and priests on these people. The Bishop Lamy, for example, in New Mexico, basically threw out all of the native priests who were there and imposed a system of Americanization. Both the Protestants and the Catholics started schools to Americanize these Mexicans who are now U.S. citizens. During this time, through about 1900, little past, people crossed the border because it wasn't a real defined border. I mean, there was a line, people knew you were now in Mexico and the United States, but people could cross freely and did all the time. Beginning 1900 or so, the pattern begins to change, especially after 1910. 1910, the Mexican Revolution begins the first push north. People are trying to flee the violence that's happening in Mexico and come into the United States. 1914, the United States becomes a part of World War I into 1917, and it's sending soldiers to Europe, and so it needs cheap labor to take the space and the place of those soldiers who are now at war. And so this migration north, this push factor comes with the pull factor, and people are quite happy to have all of these workers come. Now, in the middle of this, churches started to become concerned about them, started helping them, started working with them, but basically are not questioning the political and the social realities of this. These are poor people that need our help, is the kind of the general attitude. But when the Great Depression comes in 1929, then Americans, white Americans, say, Mexicans should not get jobs. We should get the jobs first. And so the United States starts a forced repatriation of all of these people. About 500,000 were forcibly returned to Mexico in a pretty inhumane situation, including many who were born in the United States, because at the end of the day, they were all Mexicans. And white Christians, even if they were concerned about these people, nobody said, hey, wait a minute, this is unjust, this is unfair. It just happened. It's interestingly enough, Latino Pentecostal churches that had been full all of a sudden were deported, sometimes wholesale, back to Mexico. That situation continues through the 1930s, but then in 1941, with the U.S. entering World War II, there again is a need for cheap labor. And so once again, the United States, this time now with treaties with Mexico, starts what has been known as the Bracero program, the Strong Arm program, where people are brought to the United States to work, especially in agriculture, to replace against the soldiers who have gone to war. Interestingly enough, the Bracero program, even though it was supposedly for the war effort, the vast majority of Braceros come legally into the United States after the war in the 1950s, because industrial agriculture is looking for cheap work. Now, in the midst of all of this, one sees how industrial agriculture is starting to develop, and it's looking for workers. And so both people from Mexico and also Mexican Americans from South Texas, New Mexico in particular, start migrating and become migrant workers. So they might work for a while for a part of the laboring season in the Yakima Valley of Washington, in parts of Oregon, in the central San Joaquin Valley of California, in the Imperial Valley of Southern California, and in other places, and then go back to Texas or go back to Mexico. In fact, my family was part of that migratory pattern. And in the midst of all of that, then, churches, especially historical Protestant churches, start asking bigger questions about this situation and about the rights and the needs of migrant workers, and start separating those who are U.S. born from those who are immigrants. And so U.S. historic denominations start helping migrant workers. They're going to work especially with agricultural interests, and little by little are going to be supporting them. And as one gets into the 1960s, they will support, for example, Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Movement. And you'll see then in the early 60s, both Protestants and Catholics marching together to support farm labor rights. In the middle of all of this, braceros are coming, but many undocumented are also coming from Mexico. And the response to the undocumented in the 1950s was Operation Wetback. About 1.5 million people, again, were forced back to Mexico. And in the midst of this, again, this deportation process, there was almost no one saying, hey, wait a minute, this is not right. Parallelly, after World War II, from Puerto Rico, remember they're U.S. citizens, so in a sense they're not immigrants, though they're treated as such when they come to the mainland, are also drawn and encouraged to move into the northeast of the United States The ones that worked in the fields were called tomateros, tomato pickers, if you will. And then many went into New York City, and you start seeing that Puerto Rico out-migration into especially the Northeast. So though they aren't immigrants in any legal sense, they're also part of this migratory pattern. In the middle of all of this, the Cuban Revolution. Remember, if you know the history of the 20th century, this tension between the East and West, between communism and capitalism, between atheism and Christianity. And all of a sudden, communism has a foothold in Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, which succeeds in large part because of the injustices that were happening in Cuba and in other parts of Latin America. And so what happens is the United States opens the floodgates and allows Cubans, especially anti-communist Cubans, well-educated Cubans, to leave the island. And through the 1960s, large numbers of Cubans will come to the United States. Now, they're educated. Many of them are already leaders. Many of them have money, are able to bring money. And so they all of a sudden are in a different place. So you've got the Mexicans who are laborers, the Puerto Ricans who are laborers, the Cubans who in significant percentage are professionals. And so even though they're all Hispanics or Latinos, they are very different, where the Mexicans, if you're undocumented, if you're a wetback, you get repatriated, but if you're a wetback from Cuba, you get accepted as a political refugee. And so this kind of situation creates a different reality, because all of a sudden the Cubans, and to a lesser extent the Puerto Ricans, are coming with much more education. They'll become leaders. You will see from the 60s on where Cuban refugees become important leaders in the life of many churches, many denominations, including the Catholic Church, and how, because they've come with education, they're able to establish themselves and gain political power much more quickly than the people that would come before. And so one sees, as one gets to 1965, a growing church concern for supporting migrant workers in particular, a disposition to help resettle the refugees from Cuba, and a situation, though, where the undocumented are still deported and no one seems to really be that concerned about them. And so there we get to 1965.